Welcome to the expensive side of Flesh and Blood, Legendaries. And no, I actually don't mean in terms of collecting, I mean in terms of competitive play. So if you do want to assemble yourself a viable deck list for high competitive play, even moderate and middle level competitive play, chances are you're going to have to get your hands on a few of these Legendaries. Most likely, at least, a Spring Tunic, which by itself already has a 200 plus price tag associated to it. So what does this mean? Well, to actually play Flesh and Blood competitively and, again, have a viable deck, chances are you're going to have to spend a decent amount bulking up your collection with some of these more high-end cards, especially the equipment. Now, this is probably the biggest issue Flesh and Blood has from an entry perspective, is the legendary system. So rightfully so, legendaries are powerful and they are scarce. That is fantastic. They also seem to have a long life ahead of them. The majority of legendaries will see continued use, and while other cards might arise to compete with them, chances are both sets are still going to be viable. But that leads to the issue of price. So legendaries generally have two printings. They have a cold foil and a rainbow foil variant. They have scarce pull rates, one in a case. When you compare that to any other form of equipment, you generally see three printings, cold foil, rainbow, and a normal. And of course, they all have far easier pull rates, making it a lot easier to even get your hands on majestic equipment. Yet, legendaries are so vital to a competitive deck that you have no choice but to bulk up your collection with these pricey cards, leading to the general assumption that, well, Flesh and Blood is an expensive card game. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but there is a few underlying problems around this system and the general system that LSS seems to be using when it comes to making and releasing sets. From a community perspective, we have no guarantee of what legendaries we'll see in the next set. We don't know if there will be a legendary item to compete with any of the previous legendary items, and any legendary that is generally assigned to the generic slot will see substantially higher value as it is now applicable to every single hero. Something like the Crown of Providence is a high-priced card because it is extremely playable amongst every single hero in the game. Same can be said for the Arcanite Skullcap, and of course the Spring Tunic. Spring Tunic of which only really has one viable competitor at the moment, the Flamescale Furnace, and that in itself is limited to a specific set of heroes. Now, I'm not saying that LSS needs to downgrade the power level of legendaries or upgrade the power level of majestic cards to make them somewhat competitive with legendaries, but we are going to get to the eventual point when every viable deck or any highly competitive deck will see a legendary equipment occupy almost every slot on the board. And I personally don't think that this was Legend Story Studios' real intention when it came to legendaries. And we're seeing that sort of be utilized in these new sets when we get legendary cards like Soroya, the Emperor, and all these other variations that aren't equipment, but then are still part of, again, that promised rarity slot when it comes to breaking open a box. So then, what does this mean for the future of the game? Because I certainly don't want it to get to the point where you need to own every legendary related to your hero to actually play competitively. I am personally someone who likes to make goofy and fun decks. For instance, the only legendary that I really have been using is Flick Knives because it has a nice niche effect that I can build something a bit more dynamic around than just running, say, a Spring Tunic simply for the ability to have the most optimum resource generation. But there are obviously a lot of players out there who want to be competitive and a lot of people who want to get into the competitive scene. Starting out with Flesh and Blood, the Spring Tunic, when it was the only really legendary you needed, well, that wasn't too bad. But now we're at the point where if you want to, say, run Assassin, chances are you're going to have a Spring Tunic, a Flick Knives, and possibly a Black Tech Whisperers. So 3 of your 4 equipment slots or armor slots are occupied by legendaries. And then Legend Story Studios has also created this issue where they cannot allow a single hero to sort of eclipse any other by having access to more usable legendaries or higher power cards than the rest. And this will be even more evident when they release any new heroes. As soon as a hero is released, it needs at least one legendary to be competitive because the legendary effects are significantly greater than that of the cards before them. Now, altogether, Legendaries feel as they should. They are expensive, powerful cards, but there isn't a great sense of competition to them. The Flamescale Furnace is a great example of a competitor to the Spring Tunic. However, again, it has the limitation of only being supported by 3 heroes, FaB, Dromai, and the Emperor, because they're the only Draconic heroes we have at the moment. I think having a core set of cards within each set that needs to be printed in some designscape would be the best path forward. For instance, having a strong chest resource generator in every 1 to 2 sets that is limited to certain heroes would be a great idea to then give variation and variety to anyone who wants to jump into the game. They don't have to be as powerful as the Spring Tunic, but they should still be competitive so that anyone who wants to sort of get into the game has still a powerful but slightly cheaper alternative to the Spring Tunic. The other avenue to sort of travel down is the fact that we will need reprints of these cards in lesser versions. The History Pack is probably the greatest point at which we will see a few of these cards hit the white border variation, but still having a normal version of the Legendaries would be a great idea to still make them accessible. I know that will probably harpen a lot of people's opinion on the card. Again, I personally, I don't like dilution of certain cards, but these are so crucial to the game. They're not like other cards, for instance, in Line and Strike or Command and Conquer, because these cards are subject to, randomization of the deck. Equipment in itself is a special system because it starts on the board, and therefore any equipment you do run is vastly more powerful than any of the cards in your deck because it is a guarantee to a player. So having the right equipment is the first step, if you will, in actually constructing a deck. So in line with that, we need more options, at least at the entry level, for equipment cards. I think they should continue to expand the legendary rarity to other cards outside of equipment, because Soroya, while a powerful light illusionist card, isn't necessarily an auto-include like something like the Spring Tunic or Phantasmal Footsteps or Luminaris when we had the initial version of Prism. And what really separates the majestic equipment cards that are almost auto-includes is the simple fact that, again, there are those 3 printings. You have Cold Foil, you have Rainbow, and you have the ability to pull a normal version of the card that will be more cheaper and more accessible to someone wanting to include it in their deck. Legendaries simply don't have that. The only one we do have is a Spring Tunic, and that was printed out of the necessity that it was such a staple card and in the most limited printings of any sets. Overall, this leads to sort of the conclusion that either more Legendaries need to be printed. I think the ratio should be somewhat more equivalent to the actual hero numbers we have, because again, we have far exceeded the principal amount that was available in the first 2, 3, 4, 5 sets. We've continued to increase the pool, so we need to have more Legendaries so that we continue to dilate that pool to the same degree that we are introducing new heroes, and we're not seeing that just yet. The other issue that might need addressing is, again, the variations that we see for Legendaries. I believe the Crown of Dominion had a Marvel variation. Dynasty was the only set that had marveled equipment, right? Outsiders were the Codexes, and Uprising were the Dragons. Dusk Till Dawn looks to be the Angel cards, or some sort of ally cards, given the running themes. Now, I don't hate the Legendary system. I think it is a wonderful aspect of Flesh and Blood to have these substantially powerful cards actually feel powerful and rare. But at the same time, it is the greatest hurdle to anyone getting into the game because they are so necessary to a competitive deck. Almost every deck list you see that places high in any events will run some of the Legendaries. And now Dusk Till Dawn will see 8 Legendaries, an increase over the 5 featured in Outsiders. But of those 8, I'd be amiss if 1 or 2 of them weren't connected to Light and Shadow in the form of, again, allies rather than equipment. So even if you were to say all 8 would be new equipment on offer, of those 8, they can't all support every hero in the game, nor can those 8 support all the 4 slots each hero has. So from that, I personally think there are 2 ways that Legendaries can progress. Either they become the norm, so they then occupy all 4 slots of equipment when it comes to head, chest, arms, and legs, or they need to become sort of very niche cards with unique effects, so that they only then support certain archetypes, and we see the majority of Majestic occupy equipment slots. However, from looking at deck lists currently, well, generally speaking, Legendaries occupy by far the higher amount. This is the first place Oldheim deck. We have Crown of Seeds, Ferndale's Spring Tunic, and Vambrace of Determination. That's 3 Legendaries. Even if you do consider the fact that these might be supplemental cards that you swap out and sub in, it's still an issue that a competitive deck has to see a high number of Legendaries featured to, again, be viable at the higher end of play. There is also an upside to this if you want to consider all avenues, and that is the fact that, by and large, Legendaries seem to be very hardy, long life cards, right? They're going to stick around for the majority of play, so they are still a great investment. We talked about this in the previous video. If you can get around the upstart cost of Flesh and Blood, well, chances are your core collection is going to service you for the majority of play, and you're only going to have to pick up certain cards here and there to build around that core collection. Altogether, I am somewhat happy with the Legendary system. I like the power level and the rarity of the cards, and the fact that they feel like Legendary cards. But at the same time, I don't like the aspect that a lot of them are auto-includes, like the Spring Tunic or the Crown of Providence, Arcanite Skullcap, the new Vambrace of Determination. I personally think that Legendaries shouldn't occupy the generic slot, because then they are just too broad and all-encompassing, that then there is a higher price attributed to them, because, again, every hero wants them to either play or run as a supplemental card. I strongly think that Legendaries should occupy very specific categories, so even Light is an issue. It should be Light Illusionist. Instead of Shadow, it should be, obviously, Shadow Runeblade or Shadow Brute. I think having highly specific Legendaries would be the better avenue, because then you can still have powerful cards, but there isn't going to be a huge demand to them, because not every hero will want to run and play them. I think overall that is probably the best alternative and an outlook to have for Legendaries, is that they need to become specific, powerful game pieces for certain heroes, and therefore not auto-includes for the majority. Anyway, what do you think? How do you feel about the Legendary system? Are you okay with it? I mean, like me, I have a substantial collection built up, so if I wanted to jump into the competitive scene at some point, I wouldn't have to actually pick up that much. I've already acquired that upstart cost, if you will. But as someone, getting into the game, do you think it is fair for them to have to, get these high-end cards just to be competitive? Or should there be more stronger alternatives to, for instance, the Spring Tunic, rather than just the Flamescale Furnace? We should see a stronger Majestic variant that, while not completely eclipsing the Spring Tunic, should still be somewhat of a powerful resource generator. But we'll leave it there for today. Hope you enjoyed. See ya.